very happy to welcome Stephen Davis, author of the Carly Simon biography, More Room in a Broken Heart. Before Stephen began writing biographies of rock and pop stars, he was grooving on live jazz. Growing up in New York and Philadelphia, he would go to see John Coltrane play Sunday matinees in small clubs. He moved to Boston to attend Boston University in 1965. In Boston, he attended live concerts by Led Zeppelin and Fleetwood Mac, and that's when Mr. Davis learned he loved to write about the musicians that he loved as well. He started out writing for the BU News and later became an editor at the Boston Phoenix before he landed the job of music editor for Rolling Stone. He worked on his first full-length rock biographies alongside photographer and former college roommate Peter Simon, the brother of Carly Simon. And that's how he got to know Carly, through Peter. And he always wanted to write a book about her. Fast forward to 2011, and this book, More Room in a Broken Heart, finally appeared. However, unauthorized by Carly Simon. We'll find out tonight how that came to be. Leading up to this latest biography, Stephen Davis has enjoyed a stellar career as a rock biographer. He is the author of Walk This Way about Aerosmith, Jim Morrison, Fleetwood, and the international bestseller Hammer of the Gods about Led Zeppelin, and many other titles. And Stephen Davis is the ghostwriter behind Michael Jackson's international bestseller, Moonwalk. Please join me in welcoming the man with all the stories to tell, Stephen Davis.
Well, first of all, thank you all for coming, and thank you for your friends for having me. Uh-oh. Turn my head. Okay. Are we on?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm 2,000 years old, and I've never done this before in my life. And I usually just stay at home and type, but the people from the Marlborough Library were so kind, and so I thought I would come out and speak with you tonight. I don't really have an act or a lecture prepared or anything like that, but I am here with my biographer's hat on, and so I thought I'd talk with you a little bit about some of the things that I've done in different types of biography, and maybe tell a few stories about being on the road with some of these people, and then read to you a little bit, and then we'll take some questions, and that'll be the evening, if it's okay. So, as Allison said, I started out as a reporter, writing at BU, and then we started this paper called the Cambridge Phoenix, as it was, in the late 60s. And I became the music writer. Boston, as you all know, is a great music town, and because there's like 20 zillion college students, all the bands come through to this day. And so when I graduated from college, there were three ways that a writer could make a living. You could write about politics, you could write about sports, or you could write about music. And I wasn't much into politics at the time, and nor sports, but always did love music and still do. And so that was sort of a natural way for me to go. And so I went, as Allison said, I went to Rolling Stone, and then I was a freelance writer for the New York Times and the Boston Globe and magazines and like that. In the mid-'70s, I started to hear this new music coming out from Jamaica called reggae music. And I totally fell in love with it. And I wrote an article about it for the New York Times, which they put on the front page of the Sunday art section, about this guy called Bob Marley, who was this new star coming out of Jamaica. And he was sort of the Elvis Presley of reggae. Some of you know this and some of you don't. But in any case, an editor at Doubleday, publishers in New York, saw this article and said, "We'd like to send you to Jamaica, and you and this photographer called Peter Simon will send you both down there and give you a little money, and we'd like you to write a book about reggae music." And we thought, that sounds great. So we went to Jamaica, and this was in the 1975, 76, and Jamaica at the time was in the middle of a kind of a civil war between Cuban-style socialism and the CIA on one side. So we got there, and there were tanks in the street, and we met this guy called, excuse me, Bob Marley, and all these other great stars, and we hung out with them for a long time. And we published this book in 1977 called Reggae Bloodlines, and it was my first book and with my friend Peter. And it was a sort of socio-economic story about what was going on in Jamaica and how the culture impacted that and vice versa. And so I did another one of those, and then I started working with this guy, Bob Marley, who saw my book, and he said, I'd like to do a book, and why don't we work together? And so I started hanging around with him more and more. And he was a very interesting guy because they had this very strange new millenarian religion down there called Rastafarianism. Some of you may have heard of that. And they believed that the Emperor Haile Selassie of Ethiopia was sort of a living god. And I had never heard of anything like this before. So it was a very sort of fascinating alternative spirituality to what people in the Caribbean and even in North America had been brought up with. So I was very interested in this. And I started working with this guy. By this time, he was an international champion of human rights and was going around the world and with selling out these incredible football stadiums all over the world. And so I started to work with him on his biography, on his sort of autobiography, and he started telling me his story. And then he died. He got cancer and he died at the age of 36, in the height of his fame. And so I went on and I finished the book, and it was published in 1983. It was called Bob Marley, Conquering Lion of Judah. And I had a very good agent at the time, and the book was very successful. And he said, look, it's the early 80s, and there are all these great stories still out there from the 60s and 70s, all these bands, the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and, you know, the Beach Boys and anyone you can think of. All of these are great stories waiting to be told, and maybe you're the guy that will tell them. And I thought to myself, a career. Because when you're a writer, a professional writer, it's very good to find a niche early on and stick to it. And at around the same time, I met an older writer who said to me, you know, it's nice that you want to be a writer, but the fact of the matter is that if you're going to be successful, you have to write the same book over and over again. And I thought to myself, that's pretty depressing. But then I kind of looked around, and all the writers that I admired had written the same book over and over again, whether it was Charles Dickens writing about early Victorian London, or Ian Fleming writing about James Bond, or Gore Vidal writing these political books that he did. It was, so I begrudgingly, I accepted this horrible fate and plunged on. And the next book I did was a book about the English rock band Led Zeppelin. And I had gone on tour with them in the mid-70s as a journalist. And 10 years later, I was still trying to recover from going on tour with Led Zeppelin as a journalist, because they were a very hardcore heavy metal band, and they attracted a very strange and very volatile atmospheric audience. And they were the guitar player was involved with black magic, and the singer, Robert Plant, was involved with English mysticism, and the drummer was so drunk that you couldn't talk to him. And the bass player was clinically depressed and homesick, and so it was a strange tour. But their audiences were so crazy, and I'd never seen anything like it before. I'd been to rock and roll shows, but I'd never encountered anything like Led Zeppelin's audience. This is in 1975, and today it's you know, whatever it is, 2012 in the 21st century, and my children, who are now the age I was when I went on tour with Led Zeppelin, are more interested in Led Zeppelin than they are in almost any contemporary other band. I mean, and the records have sold in the hundreds of millions of units, and there are religions out there on planet Earth that don't have as many adherents in them as Led Zeppelin has fans. And so I wrote this book called Hammer of the Gods, and this was a different kind of biography than the Bob Marley one, because this was a biography of a band, and also in a way of an era. And but I had these four guys to cover, and I realized that this was a different kind of biography. It was four different lives coming together, and you had to kind of blend them together. And then once you got them blended, you had to go on their quest with them. And I was talking about this to someone one day, and they said to me, you know, these books about bands that you're interested in, these are it's almost like the oldest form of literature. They're like quest sagas, like Jason and the Argonauts, going off with after the Golden Fleece, or Achilles and Agamemnon going up to Troy to, kick some butt and bring back some booty, and hopefully Helen also. And these are, five guys from nowhere running for the rainbow, and sometimes achieving it and sometimes not. And I thought about that, and it's kind of true in a way. You get five young men from the Midlands of England, and all of a sudden you've got like Duran Duran. And so I thought to myself, well, there's something here. So the Led Zeppelin book was very successful also. And out of that grew a different kind of biography. I was contacted by, again at Doubleday, they had an editor called Jacqueline Onassis. She'd originally been Jackie Kennedy. And she was working as an editor at Doubleday in the mid-'80s. And her job was she was the only person in America who could pick up a phone and Michael Jackson would answer it. And her job was, because anybody in America would say, oh, Mrs. Onassis is also on the line. Oh, really? And so that was her job too. So she got Michael Jackson a book contract, and they tried one writer, and it didn't work out, and they tried another writer, and it didn't work out. And when I say a writer, it's really kind of a reporter or someone who works a tape machine, because you ask questions, and you have to have a rapport with the subject, and then you get the tapes back, and you send them to the transcriber, and then you get this big mass of typewritten pages, and then you have to cut and paste and make a narrative out of it. So this was a new kind of biography for me. I'd done a straight biography of Bob Marley, and I'd done an unauthorized biography, a group biography of this band, but this was a ghost, my first and really kind of only ghost writer book, where you had to completely lose yourself and become Michael Jackson, which wasn't that easy. And one of the things but it was fun, and it wasn't boring. And at the time, I had already started working with a man called Mick Fleetwood, who was the drummer of the rock band Fleetwood Mac. And I was working, he was broke, and they called me up and they said, we need you to help Mick Fleetwood write a biography so he can make some money and get Fleetwood Mac back on their feet. So this was yet another kind of biography. It wasn't a straight biography, it wasn't a group biography, it wasn't a ghost job, it was an as told to book. That's the only word I can think of. But it's a co-byline, it would have said, so-and-so and Stephen Davis. And you see a lot of that in publishing still. But in the middle of this, I got this call from a woman who worked with Jacqueline Onassis, and they said, look, Michael Jackson has read your book about Led Zeppelin, and he doesn't like these two other writers, and he couldn't talk to them. And so we'd like you to come and see if there could be a fit. And so I said, okay. And I went to his house, and this was, he lived at his mother's house in Encino, California, in the San Fernando Valley. And this was in 1986, so he was about 28, 29 years old. And he had more money than God. This was right after Thriller, one of the biggest selling albums in history. And he was preparing a new album, and he was dancing, and they were making these recordings, and Stevie Wonder was in and out of the house. And so I met with him in his bedroom, actually, and we got to talking, and there was no eye contact. He had his sunglasses on, and he would not look at me. But I started asking him questions, and he kept thinking about them, and he'd say, no one's ever asked me that before. And my secret was my wife, who is a psychotherapist. And I called her up and I said, look, I've got Michael Jackson. She was actually in Los Angeles working, staying with me, her and my older daughter. And she said, all right, well, here's how you would approach him, assuming that we don't know him, but, here's a few ways that you can kind of break the ice. So I used her techniques a little bit, and it worked. And so we talked for a couple hours, and at the end of it, I said, look, I'm not sure I should take this job, and he looked kind of disappointed, and he said, I thought you would have worked out. I said, well, look, my wife is in town, and why don't, I'd really like her to meet you, and I'd like you to meet her, and I take a lot of good advice from her, and would that be okay? He said, all right, well, come to lunch tomorrow. So the next day comes, and we go to Michael's house for lunch, and it's me and my wife, Judy, and Michael and my daughter, Lily, who's then 7 years old. And so Michael says, all right, we're going to have lunch in my movie theater. And he has a private movie theater in the house. And so I said, well, what are we going to watch? He says, we're going to watch To Kill a Mockingbird and have lunch. And I said, okay. I said, why that? He says, what's my favorite movie? And I watch it, you know, maybe 2 or 3 times a week. And this is a black and white movie with Gregory Peck, and won a lot of Academy Awards, etc. And so we go into the theater, and my daughter Lily is sitting next to Michael, and Judy and me, and then the lights go down, and trays are brought in, delicious lunch, and the thing is screened. And about 3/4 of the way into the movie, where there's a big trial scene where this guy's been accused, a black man has been accused of killing someone, and Gregory Peck stands up to do his defense. It's a famous scene in the movies, and I look over, and Michael Jackson has tears streaming down his cheeks, just crying. And I didn't want to disturb him anyway, and so after the movie, my daughter Lily says, Michael, why are you crying? He says, I don't know, but every time I see this thing, I just start to cry. And so we talked to him for a little while more, and I made sure my wife, the whole purpose of this for me was to find out from my wife if Michael Jackson was not like insane, you know, to see if we could actually do this, make a book out of it and make it work, and you know, see if this would work out so I wasn't wasting my time like these other 2 writers that had been fired. And so we're just about to leave, and I said, you know, Michael, there's one more thing. And he goes, what? And I say, well, you know, Lily here would really like to meet Bubbles. Now, Bubbles was a chimpanzee, and it was Michael's pet chimpanzee. He had 2 pets. He had Bubbles, and he had a boa constrictor that was about 30 feet long called Muscles. And so we don't want to meet Muscles, but we'd like to meet Bubbles, who is this he was the most famous monkey in America. And he was even more famous in Japan, where when Michael Jackson played concerts in Japan, they doubled his salary if he brought Bubbles, because the Japanese loved this monkey for some reason, I don't know. So Michael says, okay, and he pushes a button, and a trainer comes in with this chimpanzee. And, you know, and we get up, and the chimpanzee, at this point, Bubbles had not been exposed to children that much. And so he takes one look at Lily, who's 7 years old, and he grabs her by the arm, and he starts dragging her out of the room. And Michael grabs her other arm, and so for about maybe 20 seconds, my daughter is the rope in a tug of war between Michael Jackson and Bubbles. And then I noticed that Lily's hand, the one that's being held by the monkey, is turning blue. And so I said, Mike, you know, this Bubbles thing's getting a little old now, you know. And I hope we don't lose a hand. And so he looks at the trainer, and the trainer comes up behind Bubbles, and he's got something in his hand, and he puts it on the back of the monkey's. Oh, first he says, as the tug of war is going on, he goes, hey, Bubbles, where are you going with my girlfriend? And this was a moment, you know, my wife and I looked at each other going, oh my God, you know, where are you going with my girlfriend, Bubbles? So finally the trainer comes up, and he puts something on the back of the monkey's head, and the monkey collapses. Bang. It was like an electric shock or something. Bong. And then after a few seconds, they kind of drag Bubbles out again, and that's the end of the thing. And we get home, and she says, you have to take this job. So I worked, and we worked with Mrs. Onassis, who was just a gas and very, very funny and very sarcastic. And we finished the book, and it was called Moonwalk. And it was just about to come out, and Michael decided to kill the book. He decided it was too revealing about his father, actually. And about, Michael had been in this group called the Jackson 5. They'd been big stars, but it had gotten a little bit scary sometimes, and he attributed some of the strangeness of his current life to the way he was brought up in this band. He was unsocialized. He never went to school. No socialization at all, no friends, no social skills, nothing. That's why he was so hard to do eye contact with. And anyway, there was panic at Doubleday. And finally, Mrs. Onassis called up his manager and said, look, this book is on press, is there anything we can do? And he said, well, Michael wants Mrs. Onassis to write a foreword. And she said, well, I never do this. I always stay out of my books. And he says, well, okay, sorry. And so he basically blackmailed Jacqueline Onassis. She wrote a foreword, and the book came out and was one of the biggest selling books in history. It's called Moonwalk by Michael Jackson. So word got out to make I could go on like this for hours, but I started getting these other jobs, ghostwriting jobs and straight biography jobs. And I took some time off and I wrote a novel, and I went to Morocco and I wrote about that. And I can't even remember all these things, but let me see. After Michael Jackson, the Fleetwood book came out. That was 9 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list. And then I got a job working with Levon Helm, the drummer of the band, and I moved to Woodstock, where they lived, and I spent a lot of time with him and went down to Arkansas, where he was from, and we published a book called Walk This Way in 1993, which was also very successful. And then I spent 3 or 4 years working on a book about the Rolling Stones, an unauthorized biography called, well, it was going to be called The Rolling Stones, and one of them, and I can't tell you which one of them helped me with it, like a back channel. And so helped me with questions of accuracy and timing and things like that. And so that book was titled Old Gods Almost Dead, after a famous Robert Graves poem of the same title. And that was published in you remember 9/11? This was published in 9/12. So it didn't really do that well, because people were thinking of other things but the Rolling Stones. So in many ways, it's one of my best books. In fact, it was published in 2001, and there hasn't been a book about the Rolling Stones published since. So it's kind of become a sort of a classic of its kind, even though I always call it my 9/12 book. After that, I went around the world twice with Aerosmith, who are a local Boston band, and they became one of the biggest bands in the world, and they hired me on the basis of the Led Zeppelin book, and I spent several years with them. And if you can imagine spending one day with Steven Tyler, again, it's like, still try to recover from that. His energy is like, wild. But that book is called Walk This Way. It was also a bestseller. It took 3 years, but the amazing thing about it was that, as I said, I went around the world twice with Aerosmith, sober. Sober. We would get to Tokyo or Frankfurt or Lisbon or Paraguay, and instead of saying, where are the girls and the cocaine, they would say, where's the meeting? And the meeting was in church basements like this, and they would go to AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, and Al-Anon meetings. And instead of vice, debauchery, rock and roll, it was spirituality and service, as they call it. And it was incredible to go to be in Paris, and instead of going to the Pigalle, to get drunk, you would go in the basement of the Protestant cathedral on the Champs-Élysées, and there would be coffee and donuts and lots of people smoking, in both. And so I went around the world and went to probably about 200 AA meetings with and I thought to myself, this is a really weird career now, And after that, that was good. After that, I remembered in 1968, when I was a student at BU, I heard that a band called The Doors were coming to Boston. And so I got tickets to a now demolished theater called the Back Bay Theater on Mass Ave. It's across from where the Christian Science thing is now. And it was a nice theater, and The Doors came out and they started to play. And I took one look at Jim Morrison, and I thought, this is the energy I want to be around every day for the rest of my life, because it wasn't an act. He really believed in what he was doing. And so 20 years later, I wanted to do a biography of Jim Morrison. There'd been lots of books about him, but I didn't think there had been a good book about him. And so my older daughter, Lily, who was in the tug of war with Bubbles, was now a grown woman living in Paris and working. And so I went to Paris, which is where Jim Morrison died. What happened was that the Doors had a very successful career in the 60s and early 70s, but then he got sick of it and he moved to Paris to be a poet. And then he mysteriously died and no one ever understood what happened to Jim Morrison. So I had I went to Paris and I started making some phone calls and I thought to myself, he was here for 3 or 4 months. Someone must have known something. And so I called a couple of French journalists and sure enough, I got a couple of phone numbers and I would call up in my terrible French and I said, listen, I'm doing this book about Jim Morrison. And they go, oh yes, Jim, And the Doors never played in France. They were never big, so he didn't really impact very much there. And I finally called this one guy whose girlfriend had owned the apartment in which Jim Morrison had died very mysteriously. And he said, oh yes, come on over. So I went over, and he's now a musician in France. He's in his 50s or early 60s. And we talked for a couple hours. He'd known Jim very well, and he said, oh yeah, I want to show you something. And he goes and reaches into a drawer, and he pulls out this grotty old plastic bag, and inside the plastic bag are Jim Morrison's 3 last notebooks, a photo file of about 100 unpublished photographs, and 2 reel-to-reel tapes of music that he had recorded in Paris. And I thought to myself, I couldn't even speak for about maybe 5 minutes because this is what every journalist wants to, this is the pot of gold at the end of the biographer's rainbow. What happened to Jim Morrison in Paris? And here it is, all his journals, his diaries. And so I got permission to use them, and I wrote this book called Jim Morrison, Life, Death, Legend. And for me, that was the greatest sort of epiphany of my career, finding that the drawer opens, and it's what every journalist, every biographer, every writer wants to find out, the secret trove of the stuff. And anyway, long story short, after that I went to California. People said to me, there was this band that doesn't exist anymore called Guns N' Roses, and they were the last great rock band, and they were to our generation what Led Zeppelin was to yours, and we'd like to see a book about Guns N' Roses written by the guy that wrote Hammer of the Gods. Okay, I said, and went out to Los Angeles, and I spent about a year, again, pounding the pavements and knocking on doors because these guys are famously contentious, and they all hate each other, and they're all alive, but they've all just been elected to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and they're supposed to appear there next month, but they're feuding, and no one knows if it's going to happen. But I decided that as a biographer, it would be much more rewarding to find the so-called little people that work with Guns N' Roses, the roadies, the road crew, the tape operators, the groupies, the girlfriends, the caterers, the sound guys. And I found all these people, and it took me a long time, but these were the people who weren't stoned out of their minds and who actually remembered all this stuff. And so it was a different way of putting together a biography. It was more secondary sources, but it was actually more valid to me because these were people this had been some of the most interesting experiences of their lives, and they were very happy. In most cases, people don't want to be left out of a story if it's being told and if they had a part in it. So all that led to a conversation I had with Carly Simon. After that book came out, it was successful, and I said, I knew Carly because my photographer and best friend, Peter Simon, college roommate, was her brother. And I also had liked writing about bands and liked writing about all these guys, but I was kind of sick of all the testosterone. And I thought to myself, and also there was a shift in the book buying public, and the demographic of people who actually went to bookstores or downloaded or whatever shifted to where women are now the major force in retail book business. And I thought to myself, well, I don't really want to retire, and I don't really want to start, writing something else. I think I'll start trying to write about a couple of these great women rock stars. Start with Carly because she's was the most accessible to me. So I called. I had been for about 10 years. I'd been trying to get her to do a kind of as told to book or a ghost book with me, and I could have gotten her a great deal of millions of dollars to do this 5 or 6 years ago, not anymore. So I finally called her up a couple years ago. I said, Carly, look, my publisher really would like a biography of you, and I'd really like to do it, and I'm going to do it, and I hope you don't mind. And she said, well, let me think about it. And she called me back a couple days later and invited me to her house on Martha's Vineyard. And she said, look, I don't really mind you doing this that much, but there's a couple of, you've known my family for 45 years, and there's a couple of things that I don't want you to publish. And if you don't publish them, I will help you sort of behind the scenes with questions of accuracy and things like that. I said, well, what are these things that you don't want me to tell you? And she told me, and they were trivial. They had to do with a couple of things about her family, one or two things about her health, and that was about it. Nothing that would have impacted her career or the narrative flow of the book. So I said, okay, let's do it. And so I went to work, and I interviewed her some. I had actually worked with Carly a few times. I had written about her music in Rolling Stone, and then she asked me to interview her for VH1. They had this series Behind the Music a few years ago, and I did that. And then a few years ago, she put out a greatest hits CD of all her, famous songs called Reflections, and she asked me to write them, the CD booklet, and so I did this. And so we had this kind of professional relationship, and I was never really close to her otherwise. She was famously married to James Taylor, and she had a couple of kids with him, and then got divorced. But I was more interested in her career as a musician because she was kind of the first woman who broke out of the standard sort of chick singer thing that used to be, the norm in rock bands, and started writing her own music. And it turned out that her father's best friend had been George Gershwin, and that she'd grown up. Her father had started the publishing firm Simon & Schuster, and she'd grown up in a milieu where people who were coming over for Sunday lunch were people like Einstein and Martin Luther King, and she and her sisters would have to sing for these people, and she had met all these famous musicians, and so in the early 70s she wanted to be a singer-songwriter, but no one wanted to hear her songs. They wanted her to sing Linda Ronstadt songs or Joni Mitchell songs, and she insisted on doing her own, and she was one of the first women to break out of that mold and become part of that very famous singer-songwriter movement that included James Taylor and Cat Stevens and Chris Christopherson and many people who became sort of the poet laureates of their generation, and she was one of them. And a few years later, she was elected to the Songwriters Hall of Fame, a rare and great honor, the first inductee of which had been George Gershwin, her father's friend. So all these threads came together into this book, and the working title for this book was called I Believe in Love, The True Adventures of Carly Simon. And I Believe in Love is a line from one of her famous songs called Coming Around Again. And so we've put the book into type. This is what's called a bound galley. It's a galley proof that has a lot of mistakes in it. And I sent one of these to her, and she read it, and before it was published, and she said, well, there's a couple things I'd like you to change, but mostly I'd like you to change the title, Coming Around Again. And I go, why? No, the title was I Believe in Love. I go, why, Carly? Why do you want me to change the title? She said, well, it's sad to say this, but I don't really believe in love anymore. And I said, what do you mean? She said, well, I've been in and out of love all my life, and I've used my love affairs to inform my lyrics and, what I do, what I write about, but I'm tired of it now. I'm whatever her age is, I'm not supposed to say. That's one of the things she didn't want me, she wanted me to suppress, actually. She said, well, Katharine Hepburn did it all her life. Why do I have to say when I was born? So I said, well, all right, well, you don't believe in love anymore. What should we call this book? And she says, well, there's another line in that same song called, don't mind if I fall apart, there's more room in a broken heart. So here we have More Room in a Broken Heart, The True Adventures of Carly Simon. The publisher went for it, they changed the title, and the book came out. And came out in January, and it's selling pretty well, and she hates it. She doesn't, it's not that she doesn't like it, she just really hates it. And I said, why do you hate it so much? And she said, well, it's too revealing. I said, well, that's a biography, it's supposed to be revealing, and you told me all this stuff. She said, I know, but I've changed my mind about it. I really hate it. And is it going to come out in paperback? I'm going, yeah, Carly. She says, oh, no. And she got her daughter, she has a daughter with James Taylor, and she got the daughter to call me up and yell at me and all this stuff. And it's true that it is a very revealing book. It's a biography. And it's true that she feels exposed, maybe overexposed, and therefore vulnerable. And no one wants to feel that way. But, and I regret that. But on the other hand, I would regret much more having written a boring book about Carly Simon. And that's one of the dilemmas that you have in being a biographer of a living person. There are people who say never write biographies of living people because it's a losing proposition unless you sell a zillion of them, because generally they won't like it, and it either turns into what's called hagiography, which is like, you know, just like a gospel, or else like propaganda, like a publicity. And that's what Carly really wanted. She says, I was expecting more of like a press release. And I said, no, you know, people won't buy that. People really want to know about your life and about how your romantic life impacted on these incredible songs that you've written. And so things are kind of quiet now, but that's kind of how we've left it. And I did see her over the summer briefly before the book came out, and she said, you know, I'm really not going to like this. I said, well, I've known you for 45 years, so let's just try to ride with it. But it came out, and then there was this a funny kind of 16 books, and for the first time, I started getting like hate mail. And I realized, and then there were terrible reviews on Amazon, even before the book published. You scroll down and it says, this is garbage. This book, More Room in a Broken Heart, is the worst book ever written, and it should be burned at the stake. And stuff like this, you can go online and read this stuff. And I realized, we did some computer hacking, and we realized that there was a campaign by a couple of writers who had wanted to work with Carly, who had started a smear campaign against this book. And I had been accused of plagiarism, of making things up, of lifting other people's material, and of invading Afghanistan. I mean, anything you can think of, they've accused me of. And I, you know, again, I'm sort of interested by this and excited after 16 books to have this reaction for the first time. And I realized that, and I called up Carly. I said, you know, Carly, your father founded Simon & Schuster, the biggest publishing house in the world. Don't you realize that there's no such thing as bad publicity in the book business? It's hundreds of books are published each week. It's very hard to get anyone interested in it, you know. And what you're doing is all of a sudden these bloggers were, you know, saying, oh, you know, this guy's made this up, or he's copied this. And then it was picked up by the newspapers, and my mother in New York, the doorman's reading the New York Post, and he goes, oh, Mrs. Davis, look what they're saying about your son. You know, she's 93, you know, so I say, Mom, sorry about this. She says, well, it's not as bad as Dominique Strauss-Kahn, but still, you know, it's not, it's still a Shonda for the neighbors, you know, it's not, so that's where we stand now. Now we're waiting for the paperback to come out. The other thing that she was angry about is this. I did break one promise to her, and that was that she didn't, her brother is a very great and famous photographer. And she said, look, I don't want, this is an unauthorized book, and I'm going to help you with certain things because, you know, I'm blackmailing you. But I don't want the photographs in the book to be all by my brother because it would make it look like a family album. I said, well, okay. And so I gave the book to my publisher in September, and they said, well, and it was supposed to be published, you know, in May, June. It usually takes 6 to 8 months. And they read the book, and they said, well, this is hot. We're going to get this out in December, January. I go, what? You know, this is crazy. There's no, which is the reason there's no bibliography in here. There's no index and anything like that. There's no apparatus because we just banged the book out. But it would have taken me about 6 weeks to, you know, go to the photo agencies and call these other photographers that had worked with her and get permissions. And on the other hand, it took me about 6 minutes to call her brother and say, hey, Pete. And there's no photographs in here. I don't know why. But if you look in the actual book itself, there's 50 unpublished photographs, and indeed it makes it look like a Simon family album going back into the 1920s to her when her father founded this company, going up until today almost. So it's another reason that she's mad at the book, because I did break this promise to her, but I was under pressure to do so. So It's not all a bed of roses being a biographer, or whether it's as told to, or ghost writer, or whatever, but it has been a lot of fun, and I really enjoyed writing about a woman, and I got there was a lot I didn't understand about the process in which a girl turns into a young woman who turns into a woman. And fortunately, I had my wife to explain all this to me. And this is how I got over these gaps, of the gender gap. I tried to read a bunch of biographies of women by women to kind of get the knack. And the last one I read was, I don't know if any of you read this, Tina Brown's book about Princess Diana. It's called The Diana Chronicles. And I learned a lot from that. Not enough to copy it or anything, but just to know how far a biographer can go in writing about a woman's romantic life, and how that turns into her history, etc. So, and people always say, well, what are you going to do next? And I thought to myself, well, I could do a book about Michael Jackson now because he's dead, and whatever it was I signed in 1986 doesn't really exist anymore. So I could do a book about that. But on the other hand, going back to this notion of wanting to sell books to women and entertain them, and the rock audience in general, and remembering that the rock audience over the last decade, the two major decades of the 60s, 70s, 80s, were the largest audience of any kind in history for any sort of media. Hundreds and hundreds of millions sold of the Michael Jackson and Fleetwood Mac and the Eagles, and there have never been planetary audiences that big before. I thought to myself, well, maybe it's too early for a career change. And who's out there? And I thought to myself, Stevie Nicks. Stevie Nicks. Now there is a story. Stevie Nicks showed up to audition for Fleetwood Mac in 1975 in a Bob's Big Boy uniform. Bob's Big Boy is a hamburger chain. And she shows up in this little, with a little brownie suit with a white apron, frilly apron, and like a frilly thing, and she starts singing. They said, well, what do you have? And she starts singing this song, Rhiannon. And they say, well, you're hired. But, there's a great story there. So I think I'm going to probably do that next, and that's the answer. Maybe I'm thinking my working title is Gold Dust Woman, Legends of Stevie Nicks. So if I live that long, I'll be back here in 2 years in Marlborough, hopefully in 2 years. We can all get together and I can tell you some hairy stories about Stevie Nicks.
There's more witchcraft with her life.
That's true. Like Led Zeppelin also. Yeah, it's true. She has owls living in her house. She has pet owls. What's not to love? Who has pet owls, So anyway, that's my story. And I thought I'd read to you a little bit about, one of the interesting things about being a biographer, I found, in fact, the most interesting thing is often not the subject of the biography itself, but the people who are important to the story. And there's a lot, because her family was so well known and so famous, there were a lot of famous people in and out of the story. But to me, the most interesting was her first husband, James Taylor, who's like such an American icon. It seems he's at the White House every 3 weeks getting another medal from whatever president, Bush, Obama, it doesn't matter. He'll show up, or they're throwing out the first pitch at Fenway and he's singing the national anthem, he's like an American icon. And but I knew him when he was maybe 15, 16 years old from Martha's Vineyard, and Carly knew him from them too. He was Jamie Taylor, and so I thought I'd read a little. His life. A biographer has to be interested in people's lives, and I find his life as interesting in many ways as I did Carly. So I thought I'd read to you a little bit about. I lived in Milton, and he went to Milton Academy for like 3 years, and so I know a lot of people who knew him as a young man, and I did too, but anyway, I thought if you don't mind, I'll just read a little bit to you about James Taylor. Maybe there's some stuff that you didn't know. This kind of starts in 1967. James Taylor had to leave Milton Academy because he told a teacher that if he had to come back for the second half of his senior year, that he was going to hurt himself and possibly kill himself. And so they sent him to a psychiatrist, and the psychiatrist got him into McLean Hospital that day. And he spent the rest of his senior year at McLean Hospital, graduating from their high school, actually, Arlington Academy, as did his younger brother, Liv, and his younger sister, Kate. There were 5 Taylor siblings. Their father was a famous academic. None of them went to college, which I think is very interesting. In fact, most of them barely completed high school. This very talented family, but also very troubled in their way. And so after he leaves Milton Academy, after he leaves McLean Hospital, he goes to New York and he joins a rock and roll band started by his best friend, Danny Korchmar from Martha's Vineyard. But he gets into trouble with heroin, and this is in 1967, and terrible trouble. And finally he calls his father, Dr. Taylor, Dr. Isaac Taylor, who gets him into a rehab program. And he gets off heroin and onto methadone, and he decides, well, I'll start. He said, when James felt better, can everyone hear? Is this all right? When James felt better toward the end of 1967, he left for England to seek his fortune there. His model was Jimi Hendrix, who had left New York as an unknown the year before, and now was the biggest rock star in the world. James's intention was to busk in the streets. That means, playing your guitar and for change. Write some new songs and get discovered. It worked. His father's mother had left him a little money, supposed to go to him on his 21st birthday. His parents let James have the legacy early. He was only 19 at the time, which was enough for him to get to London and buy a car. He packed an old acoustic guitar that he'd bought in Durham, North Carolina when he was 14, and flew to London, staying with friends in Notting Hill and Chelsea, and indeed singing for money in busy tube stations, the subway, with an open guitar case for the coins that people tossed in. He bought a little Ford Cortina and took off for Formentera, the idyllic Mediterranean island favored by Europe's hippies. He met a girl named Karen, and together they took the ferry to neighboring Ibiza, where James wrote Carolina in My Mind, one of his most famous early songs, because he was homesick. James played some of his songs for friends. A young woman who worked for the BBC and knew people in Soho, where London's music and film industry was based, encouraged him to make a demo tape and shop it around. James's money was running low in early 1968, but for £8, about $50, he purchased a 45-minute block of time in a Soho jingle studio on Greek Street. Playing by himself on a stool, recorded by one microphone, he recorded Something in the Way She Moves, Carolina in My Mind, Rainy Day Man, Night Owl, and 6 other songs. A few days later, he collected them and pressed on an acetate disc that timed out to 45 minutes. He started trying to sell his tape. James is still 19 years old, right? Spring 1968, James called his friend Danny on a hunch he might have a connection into the London music scene, and of course he did. Peter Asher, late of the hit-making British invasion stars Peter and Gordon, had taken a job with the Beatles record label, Apple, as a talent scout and A&R executive. Peter and Gordon had a run of 14 hit singles in America during the previous 3 years, including a #1 in 1964 with A World Without Love. Peter and Gordon's hits had all been written by Paul McCartney, whose girlfriend, Jane Asher, was Peter's sister. Danny's band had toured with Peter and Gordon as their American backing band connection made. Danny gave James a number for Peter Asher. Asher picked up the phone. He told James Taylor, "I'm listening to everything." James remembered. "I went in and played Something in the Way She Moves for Peter Asher. Then Peter played my acetate for Paul and John Lennon, and suddenly I was on their label. It was my big break. It was like a door opened and the rest of my life was on the other side." Paul McCartney remembered. "I heard James's demos. Peter played them for me, and I heard his voice and his guitar, and I thought he was great. And then Peter brought him around, and he played live for Paul and George Harrison at Apple's headquarters on Baker Street. So it was just like, wow, he's great. And he'd been having troubles. Peter explained that he'd just gotten clean off drugs and was in a difficult time in his life, but he was playing great, and he had enough songs for an album. George Harrison loved Something in the Way She Moves so much that he later stole the title for his song Something. James Taylor, after only a few months in London, became the first American musician signed to Apple Records. Somewhat in a state of shock, he called his parents in North Carolina and told him that everything was going to be fine because he was working with the Beatles now. James needed a recording band. Peter Asher took out ads in Melody Maker and New Musical Express. They were given an attic loft at Apple and held auditions for people who answered the ads. Musicians were hired, and Joel O'Brien came from New York to play the drums. Soon, James was drinking codeine cough syrup. Then he was smoking opium. Then he got back on heroin, plentiful in London's music world. Then he was injecting speedballs, a hot combo of heroin and amphetamine. His first album, The Brilliant James Taylor, was recorded under this influence at Trident Studios between July and October 1968, while the Beatles were making their double White album. Paul McCartney played bass on Carolina on My Mind. George Harrison and Peter Asher sang background vocals. These luminaries were, quote, the holy host standing round me that James sings about on Carolina in My Mind. It's not hard to know how he felt. The Beatles were angel-headed hipsters, avatars of their age. And here was James in their midst at the zenith of their career, sponsored by them at the beginning of his. He would come into the studio as they were finishing for the day and listen to early versions of Hey Jude and Helter Skelter. He held onto his chair while listening to the spiraling sonic vortex of Revolution Number 9. While James was working at Apple, he was trying to stay afloat mentally, but he was, as he later said, in disarray. This was some heavy stuff he was living through in his 20th year. Quote, I was changing houses every 2 weeks, high rent, too much noise, while I tried to keep to the recording schedule and fulfill Peter and Paul McCartney's faith in me. His girlfriend from New York, Margaret Corey, was staying with him. Her brother Richard, a friend of James's, was around. Their father was the comedian Professor Richard Corey, a regular on Johnny Carson's Tonight Show. In New York, James had become close to one of their friends, another troubled young soul named Suzanne Schnurr. Quote, I knew Suzanne well in New York, James said later. She was from Long Island. We used to hang out together and get high. But Susie Schnurr had committed suicide after James moved to London, and his friends let him know about it only once the Apple album was complete. James was very upset that they hadn't told him, quote, Margaret and Richard and Joel were all really close to Susie Schnurr, but they were also excited for me having this record deal and making this album, and when Susie killed herself, they decided not to tell me about it until later because they didn't want to shake me up. The day after learning of his friend's death, fighting despair, James wrote the first verse of a new song called Fire and Rain in his basement flat on Beaufort Street in Chelsea. He was using the British equivalent of methadone to combat withdrawal from heroin, but it wasn't working well. His album complete, he flew back to New York in late November 1968, checked into a Manhattan hospital for detoxification, and called his mother. There he wrote the second verse of Fire and Rain. Trudy Taylor, his mother, came to New York. A few days later, mother and son drove to Western Massachusetts, where James Taylor signed himself into the Austin Riggs Center, a private psychiatric hospital in the village of Stockbridge, amid the wintry Berkshire Hills. It was there that he wrote the third and final verse of Fire and Rain, where he goes, Suzanne, the way you came, Suzanne, what they did to you, put an end to you, etc. And that's about Susie Schnurr. So that's it. Thank you.